So what I think is it's probably everyone. We've not had any more people joining in the last minute or so. So Hannah, if you're ready, I will begin. So hello everyone and welcome to this introduction to UK policy making and campaigning. My name is Lottie and I'm hosting this session on behalf of UK Youth for Nature. And we are joined tonight by Hannah Conway. She is going to be our guest speaker for this evening, which we are very excited about. So Hannah is a policy officer for Wildlife and Countryside Link. They are the largest environment and wildlife coalition in England. And Hannah works as a policy officer for Wildlife and Countryside Link, and she manages and supports Link's green recovery work, chemicals task force and agricultural group. So welcome, Hannah.
Thank you. I didn't get myself off mute very quickly there. Thanks so much, Lottie, and nice to see you all.
So I'll just quickly run through how this session is going to work with you all. So for today's session, me and Hannah will be holding a discussion on policy making in the UK, and this will act as an introduction for you all into policy making. Then I will go through campaigning, an introduction to campaigning with you all. And finally, we will end the session with a Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout the session, please do put them in the chat. I can see the chat and Hannah can see the chat as well. So once we've gone through the introductory parts of the session, we will tackle all the questions at the end. So I think it's time that we jump into the discussion on policy making. So Hannah, my first question for you is, what exactly is policy making and why is policy making important?
Thanks, Lottie. Yeah, I mean, so I'm a real policy nerd. I absolutely love policy, and I think it's like the most important thing in the entire world, and I'll explain why. So basically, policy is kind of like a statement of intent, right? So if we're talking about the government will set out a sort of policy either in their manifesto, or they might announce it in a speech, and normally they'll kind of write it down in some kind of strategy or kind of announcement. So as I said, it's kind of a statement of intent, but I suppose a less boring way of describing it is that it's the thing that governs all of our lives. So if you're looking at government policy, which I'll mainly be talking about because that's kind of my field of expertise, but obviously we all know that, you know, businesses can have their own policies and so on, and so can, you know, educational institutions. But when we're talking about government policy, they'll set out what they want to do in public, and then that's what that they use to kind of drive change. And the reason that I think policy is so important is because it governs every aspect of our lives. Everything that we, you know, do and don't do or can and can't do, it is sort of set by policy. But importantly, what policy does is it drives that kind of positive change. So when we're talking about nature and we're talking about the environment, the way that environmental improvements come about oftentimes is through government policy. So we'll go into the details a little bit later on kind of, you know, some examples and also sort of how the process works essentially. But yeah, I just think it's the most vital thing, because if you don't have the right policies in place, if the government doesn't have the right policies in place for the environment, then it's very unlikely that the environment will kind of survive essentially. And we've seen from the last couple of, you know, from the last however many years that we face an existential threat when it comes to biodiversity decline and climate change. And if we don't have the right policies in place, then we absolutely, you know, we're absolutely doomed to fail. And I sound dramatic, but if we don't have the right policies in place, then genuinely we won't survive, and neither will nature, and we are part of nature, obviously. So it's just, yeah, it's absolutely vital. I can't stress that enough.
Yeah, so I'm getting the impression, you know, policy is very important when it comes to protecting nature in the UK. And that kind of leads me on to my next question. So policy is important, but how exactly is policy made here in the UK?
Yeah, so I mean, policy is obviously dictated by government most of the time. So, as I said, the government will come out and they'll say, this is what we're going to do, and then they'll have to enact it either through legislation or through kind of other levers like investment. But I guess there's a whole kind of, there's a whole sort of process for that happening, right? So before the government is elected, they'll have a manifesto, they'll say what they want to do in that manifesto, but it will normally be very vague. So for instance, in the Conservative Party manifesto in their 2019 general election, they said, they made a statement that said they'll leave the environment in a better place from when they found it, which is kind of a very vague kind of commitment. But then off the back of that, when the government is elected, they employ a cabinet. So you have secretaries of state who are sort of responsible for different areas of work. So you have a secretary of state on trade, you have one you've got one on business and environment, but you've also got the DEFRA secretary, which is the one that that we're most interested in. So that's the Department for Environmental, the Department for Environment. So I guess, so then the Secretary of State will kind of set the more detailed policies. So, okay, what does leaving the environment in a better state than it was before actually mean? And what are the policies and pieces of legislation that we need to get there? But I guess kind of something that I wanted to mention as part of this kind of policy process, I didn't want to go into, the really boring detail on like who says what and, how law is made, because obviously, that's not what today is about. It's more of a general conversation. So instead of that, I kind of wanted to flag that, a really important part of policy making is us, is the public, is civil society. So obviously, the government sets what the policies are, but we play a really important role in that as well, because organisations like UK Youth for Nature, something we're trying to do at Wildlife and Countryside Link, all of the members of the public and all of the campaigners that are here today are really important for kind of pushing the government to either improve their policies or create new ones, or even scrap ones that aren't very good. So we're a really important part of that policy making process as well. So I don't know if I've gone into enough detail there, Lottie, but that's kind of a vague explanation.
No, that's been really useful, and I really like the way that you highlighted that the public are a really important part of policy making. And I totally agree. Before I came into campaigning spaces, I had no idea about policy, and I thought policy was for politicians. Like, I didn't realize that actually the public have a big influence in policy, and I think that's really great that you highlighted that. And my knowledge of policy was very small I didn't really know anything about policy when I joined UK Youth for Nature. And this kind of leads me to my next question, because one thing I've seen quite a lot is the words policy and legislation thrown around together. So I kind of wanted to know, what is the difference between policy and legislation?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because often they are kind of used interchangeably, but they are a bit different. So policy is kind of, as I said before, it's like the thing that sets the direction of travel. So, it kind of outlines what the government are going to do and how they're going to achieve it. So, and then legislation is like the hardcore kind of law that enacts that policy. And then sometimes it can be the other way around as well. So like government will set a policy and then they'll make a law, but then there's loads of policy that comes as a result of that. So I don't know whether I'm explaining it very clearly, but essentially, they're intrinsically linked because, in order to justify a piece of law, especially if it's a new piece of law, or if it's scrapping any piece of law, or if it's amending any piece of law, the government will have to have a policy which kind of outlines why they're doing it and what their intention is. So yeah, I mean, if we take an example, you know, as I said, the kind of conservative environment, the Conservative Party manifesto, you know, made a few commitments on the environment. They then kind of, you know, brought to fruition the Environment Act, which is legislation. And that piece of legislation committed to halting the decline of species by 2030, which is a binding commitment. It also committed to it also put in place the kind of legal mechanism by which the 25-year environment plan kind of sits underneath. So it means that then the government have committed to keeping the 25-year environment plan as a policy, but they will continue reviewing that policy. So Environment Act is the legislation, but the 25-year environment plan is the policy.
Yeah,
I hope that kind of explains it, but I'm willing to take questions on that later.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And just, I mean, that's kind of left me with a question quickly. You said that the I think it was the 2030 target was a binding legislation.
Yeah.
So that means the government has to meet that target. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So they do have a binding commitment to meet that target, and obviously they're kind of held to account by us, but also by, you know, the Office of Environmental Protection, which is also a new body that was set up under the Environment Act. So yeah, they are legally committed to meeting that target. But I suppose where the sort of tricky bit comes in, where we're defining what that target actually means. So what does halting the decline of species look like, and what are the kind of benchmarks in order to measure that? So are they looking at every single species, and how are they going to do that, and how are they going to measure that? Because at the end of the day, the government will set the policy which enacts that piece of law. So they'll decide what the benchmarks are, and then we have to say whether they're good enough or not, basically, because sometimes, you know, the government can be a bit lax in terms of the policies that they set for themselves, and we have to say that won't meet your target for you. You have to do it better.
Yeah, and I guess that's good, isn't it, really, to, you know, be able to hold the government to account, because they're never going to be perfect, especially it seems when it comes to the environment and policies around the environment. But that leads us on quite nicely, really, to talk about an example of a successful nature policy. So, you know, if you have an example of a successful nature policy you'd like to share.
Yeah, so I kind of struggled with this, because I've kind of got two examples. One is on a sort of piece of legislation, which obviously came from policy. So it's an EU policy originally, and then became a piece of legislation. So it's called the Habitats Regulations, which I'm sure many of us have heard of. So again, as I said, so it's an EU piece of legislation, and it currently protects sort of 256 what are called sort of special areas of conservation cover it, and that covers 5.6 million hectares in the UK, and then also there are 88 special protection areas covering 2 million hectares. And this basically means that there are areas designated which have really strict protections for specific species purposes. So it means that any projects that could affect these sites have to kind of go under special assessment. It's known as like a habitat regulation assessment. And if they're shown to have, if any kind of project or development is shown to have potentially negative impacts on those particular habitats and species, it means that they can be rejected. So I mean, in terms of like, just to make it a bit more concrete, so like with rivers and streams and coastal waters at the moment, the habitats regulation prevent any kind of unsustainable development. So if you have house building that will like really negatively impact water quality because of like, you know, pollution from that development, then they can be rejected as a result of these regulations. And then yeah, so it's kind of like, I think it's been a success because time and time again, all of the evidence points to the fact that if we didn't have these regulations, and if we haven't had the policy which led to these regulations, then, you know, the protections for species and habitats in the UK would just be significantly weaker. And actually, they are under threat at the moment. So I hope that lots of you have seen on Twitter, there's been a whole Twitter storm about something called the Retained EU Law Bill, or the Brexit Freedoms Bill. So what that does is it basically means that unless the government says otherwise, all of the legislation that we've inherited from the EU will be scrapped by the end of 2023, which is very soon. And the Habitats Regulation comes under that. Also things like, you know, the Air Quality Act, also the Water Framework Directive. So there are loads of really, really vital protections in law for our environment, which are currently under threat. And I think, yeah, it's just, I think, again, this is really a time when we're realizing that, you know, we're looking at all of the evidence on kind of, you know, specific species recovery or water quality over the past kind of 20-30 years. And we're seeing how vital these policies and pieces of legislation are. Yeah, so there's a very big pushback going on at the moment. So that's the one I wanted to pick. And that, there's a couple on the upcoming front as well. But I don't know, sorry, back over to you, Lottie. I don't know if
it's all right. And I think that's really interesting, you know, highlighting what's happened in the past week in terms of the government making changes. And as you said, like on Twitter, there's been lots of noise across social media. You know, a lot of the large wildlife organizations have kind of banded together. But it's also really interesting to think, you know, nature in the UK is not in a good place right now, but it'd probably be way worse if we didn't have any of these policies. And I think that's a really interesting thought. But yeah, I'd love to hear some, you know, an example of an up and coming nature policy you have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just before I move on to that, I think, you know, yeah, I'm absolutely not trying to sugarcoat it. Like there is so much work to be done, and definitely, yeah, you know, the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. So it means that our policies and our laws haven't been as effective as they should be. But often that's because, you know, either they're not implemented properly, and there's not enough kind of resource to put into implementing them. And in some cases, it means that, you know, there are other policies and laws elsewhere which kind of are pushing against them. So they're underriding them, because often there's kind of a lack of join up. So the government might say, oh, you know, we've got these habitats regulations, but then on the other hand, they might be investing in really unsustainable developments and finding loopholes and ways around, you know, ways around kind of the habitats regulations, or in fact, kind of making negative, you know, having negative impacts with developments elsewhere while having the habitats regulations in other places. So it's kind of, yeah, I think across the board, you know, nature policy shouldn't just be a thing that is dealt with in DEFRA and in the Department for Environment. It should be dealt with across the whole government. And I think that's one of the reasons at the moment why, you know, why so many nature policies are kind of unsuccessful or less successful than they should be, because there isn't that join up. And there isn't that kind of, you know, the whole government, every single department getting behind making nature better, basically. So anyway, that was slightly tangential. So up and coming nature policies. So the one I picked is an interesting one, which I think, we're yet to see the success of. But I wanted to talk a bit about environmental land management. So environmental land management, if you haven't heard about it, is the policy that it was actually the previous Conservative government brought about. So after we left the EU, we left what's known as the Common Agricultural Policy. So we had to create our own policy for farming. And that's what environmental land management is. So it's basically based on sort of the principle of what we call public money for public goods. So before, when we were in the EU, under the Common Agricultural Policy, farmers and land managers would receive payments based on how much land they had. So if you, Lottie, owned 10 acres of land, then you'd get a certain sum of money as a result of that. And while there were some kind of environmental conditions attached to that, they're quite weak and they're quite loose. So basically you could kind of just do with, you could do with that money what you wanted to, and you weren't really held accountable particularly. So you were receiving public money for basically nothing. But what the principle of public money for public goods does is it means that, yes, the government is still going to pay farmers, but instead of just giving them money unconditionally, what they're trying to do is give farmers money for producing environmental goods. So that means stuff like agroforestry, so planting trees on their land in order to help the soil and in order to help biodiversity, and to help the government meet net zero. So environmental land management is currently kind of in development, and there are a few kind of schemes that are available to farmers right now. So it's already begun, but we're still in the agricultural transition, which ends in 2027. So there's a lot of work to do. And with this new government, again, there's a slight threat that it's going to be watered down. And already, while we're quite happy with the sort of general direction of travel, we think that it needs to be much more robust and it needs to be much more ambitious to actually make a difference to nature. But essentially, if it's successful, what it means is that our taxes, if you're sort of paying taxes, or anyone's taxes, when they go towards kind of farmers and land managers, it means that they'll go towards things that benefit nature, they benefit you and I, and they benefit the climate. So, fingers crossed, or rather than fingers crossed, let's campaign to actually make that a good policy.
Yeah, and that leads us on really well, actually, because I think, we've got the view that nature policy in the UK could be better in terms of what the government are doing and the legislations they're doing. So from your experience, how can people, and especially young people, get involved with policy work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So it kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning. So, saying that the public are really important parts of the policy process, I think that's absolutely the case. So if young people want to get involved in policy, campaigning is 100% one way to do that. So I think we'll probably have a lot of people in the room who are already involved in policy work. But in terms of kind of making it a profession, I mean, to be honest, I think that, ultimately, obviously you've got, the DEFRA department, but other than that, you have kind of non-governmental organisations often who are doing the majority of the work. So NGOs, as we know, are organisations like UK Youth for Nature, Wildlife Countryside Link, RSPB, National Trust, and these are all charitable organisations who kind of do a lot of the heavy lifting, to be fair. And then you also have kind of government agencies like Natural England and the Environment Agency. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that, a lot of the jobs in nature policy are in charities, or at least in my experience, they are. And I think it can be quite a tricky sector to get into because it can be quite a competitive sector to get into. But I think if you are out campaigning and you are proactive, then that's definitely like the right way to go. And it's definitely like, you know, to gather experience by campaigning and by kind of actually being involved in movements, particularly like UK Youth for Nature. That's a really good start. But I think it can be a barrier in terms of, you know, when you go for a policy job, often, we were talking about it earlier, Lottie, weren't we? Like often they'll want experience already. And obviously there are some internships available out there. And I was very lucky because I managed to, when I was starting my career, I managed to get an internship and it was paid, because I think if I hadn't got a paid internship, I just wouldn't have been able to afford to like actually, you know, do that internship. So it's just kind of trawling the opportunities that are out there, speaking to people as well. Like obviously the more people you know who are working in the policy space, the better, because then, you know, you kind of get to know them and you get to know how you can be involved. Yeah, so I don't know, I think also obviously, yeah, so I would say through volunteering is obviously extremely kind of crucial, and it helps also to have a background in some kind of social science. So I did a degree in international relations and politics, so that can help as well. But yeah, volunteering is a really great way to go if you've got the time and resources to do that. If you don't, obviously you can kind of be involved online, and that's a really important thing as well. And then sort of aside from that, yeah, just kind of keeping an eye out for any kind of paid opportunities that you can. And I think as well, just to say finally, obviously if you want to go into nature policy, that's great. If you're struggling to find kind of nature policy jobs, if you're looking for paid positions, but you can say you can get a policy job in another area, say like social care, that might be a good way in as well, because if you have generic policy experience, then sometimes those skills are transferable. So yeah, I hope that helps. But obviously everyone's experience is different. And Lottie, I don't know if you've got any kind of hot tips.
No, well, I definitely think what you said about your background is in a social science, so you don't have to be studying biology or ecology to go into nature policy. You know, you can be studying, as you said, international relations or a similar subject. And I completely agree with, is if you can get those transferable skills to then get the ideal role that you want, that's still a worthwhile route to take. And you also mentioned about, you know, volunteering online, and I 100% agree. When I first joined UK Youth for Nature, most of the volunteering work I did for them was solely online. I mean, most of the team I've only actually met through a computer screen. So definitely, you know, you don't have to volunteer in person. There are lots of opportunities out there, and to do work online. So I'm just looking at the time. I'm just conscious of making sure we're working on time. So thank you very much, Hannah, for going through those questions with us. Before we get onto the Q&A section, so I'm seeing your questions. I know they're there, so keep adding to them to the chat, and we will do them in the Q&A section at the end. I'd just like to run through a bit of an introduction to campaigning with you, and at any point, Hannah, if you want to interject, please feel free to do so. So first of all, I would just like to talk to you briefly about some of the traditional methods of campaigning. So to start with, you've got letter writing or writing emails to MPs. So these could be your local MPs, or these could be MPs within a particular role in government. And this is, you know, raising awareness that you're concerned about the issue, or making that MP aware of your campaign and that, you know, you want them to know about this issue. And you can do this yourself. So, you don't have to be part of a massive campaign. If there's something that you feel this needs changing in my local area, you can contact your MP. There are also platforms for templates. So a lot of campaigns will provide templates for contacting your MP, because sometimes when it comes to emailing or writing to your MP, it can be a bit difficult to know where to start. So that can be a really good kind of starting point, is to use a template. Then another traditional method of campaigning is petitions. Now, you can create petitions on the UK government and Parliament website. And if your petition reaches 10,000 signatures, then you will get a response of some kind from the government. But the key kind of number to get is you want your petition to reach 100,000 signatures if possible, because this means your petition will be considered for debate in Parliament. Now, there's no guarantee that they will debate your petition, so you have to bear that in mind. But even if in the unfortunate situation your petition is not debated simply because it's similar to another petition, or they have something coming up in the future that is similar that they want to debate, getting a petition to 100,000 signatures is still going to be great for your campaign. That's going to be really good publicity, and the more signatures you get, you find it kind of snowballs and you'll get more and more people signing up. So as I said, even if it doesn't get debated in Parliament, or if it gets debated in Parliament and you don't get the outcome you want, still getting a large amount of signatures is going to be a really good thing for your campaign. Another aspect of traditional campaigning is direct lobbying. So this is where you communicate directly with someone in Parliament to get their support for your policy or your campaign. And a really good example of this is the This Time Is Now campaign by the Climate Coalition. So they ran a mass lobbying event, and they had, I think it was over 12,000 individuals came to Westminster to lobby politicians on climate, nature, and protecting people. And that had a really big impact. And again, having an event like that is going to draw people in and draw media attention to your campaign. And then this takes us on to the idea of additional campaigning methods. So they're kind of, writing to MPs, petitions, and lobbying, they're seen as your traditional parts of campaigning. Whereas you have additional methods of campaigning. So you could have non-violent action. So an example of this is protests. And protests are usually something that disrupt the normal comings and goings of everyday life. And another really great example of protests is the Fridays for Future campaign. So this is where they got school children to do school strikes on a Friday. And we've all been to school, so we know you go in at 9 and you leave at 3, whereas these children were leaving and striking on a Friday. So that's their crux. That's what they're doing. They're disrupting the normal everyday life, and that's how they draw people in, by causing that disruption to everyday life. And then you've also got social media, which is an incredible resource for campaigning. Creating cross-platform social media assets are going to mean you massively increase your reach. You're going to widen your audience, so you might attract people who may never heard of your organization or campaign before. But this also helps with raising awareness of your campaign. As people share things on social media, you're creating a ripple effect, and it spreads out wider and wider. And this leads me on to the idea of creative campaigning. So if you bear with me one moment, I'd just like to share my screen, and I will take you through some. So I hope you can see the right screen. Bear with me one moment. But the idea of creative campaigning is to combine the arts combine something creative to draw people's attention. And is it going to work? I apologize. I have a very old laptop and it's currently thinking about working. Let's just see. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to work. I knew I was going to get caught out with a technical problem. I called it. I was like, it's too good to be true. We've not had any technical problems so far. But what I will do is I will make sure that we share those pictures with you. But UK Youth for Nature ran 2 really great creative campaigns. So the first one I'd like to talk to you about is Wild Walls. And if I wasn't having technical problems, I would show you some beautiful pictures of some amazing murals that UK Youth for Nature commissioned in cities across the UK. And these were done with local artists and communities from these cities to install murals depicting locally declining species. And the benefit of this creative campaign is that those murals are going to last a long time. So the effect of that campaign is ongoing because it's a piece of artwork. So not only do they look really nice, but they're going to draw attention. And especially in cities, you know, there might be kids who maybe have never seen the animal depicted on that mural before in real life. So having something like that, a long-lasting campaign, is going to make a really big difference to your campaign for your organization, and it's a long-lasting draw, and that's a really good aspect to have. Another campaign, and I will share the link to it, so hopefully you'll be able to see that. I won't, unfortunately, because I can't share it, but I will put the link in the chat, is our Lines in the Sand campaign. So UK Youth for Nature partnered with Sand in Your Eye to create a 50 square metre drawing on Scarborough Beach that represented biodiversity in Britain. And, you know, this is a massive piece of artwork. So this was a real draw, and it had a really kind of successful effect in the media. So, for example, this was just after I joined UK Youth for Nature, and I'd received my RSPB magazine, and I was flicking through and I saw their campaign in the RSPB magazine, and you know, that was a really big draw for me to join UK Youth for Nature, seeing that. So having these large scale creative campaigns can not only be a great way to draw attraction to your campaign through the media, but they're also a good way to get other people involved. You know, if it wasn't for me seeing that image in the RSPB magazine and thinking, wow, that's really cool, I want to be a part of that, you know, I might not have joined UK Youth for Nature. So it's not just about garnering attention for your campaign, it's also about getting supporters as well, and people who want to be involved. And finally, I will stop talking in a minute. I just want to go through a few kind of top tips for a successful campaign. So if you want to run your own campaign, you want to think about having something tangible in your campaign to gain traction to. So this could be a location. So say, for example, there's pollution in your local river, and that's where you want to base your campaign. It's going to be around your local river. Or it could be a time or an event. So maybe your campaign is raising awareness around COP15 or COP27. If you can create something tangible to base your campaign around, that helps it to gain traction and get other people who are also interested in that aspect involved in your campaign. You also want to have policy asks with your campaign as well. So these are going to be something that gives a solution to a problem. So, for example, one of the policy asks for the UK Youth for Nature Lines in the Sand campaign was that the UK government has greater ambition in its 30 by 30 commitments to protecting nature. And the reason this came about is that the government claims that nature and protected areas in the UK already comprise of 20% 20%, 26%, sorry, of land in England. But the reality is it's mainly like 5%. So this policy ask was created to ensure that the government improves this, that it's not just 30 by 30 of any land, it's 30 by 30 of good quality, highly protected land. And finally, and I think this is probably the most important aspect of a successful campaign, is collaboration, collaborating with as many people and as many organizations as possible on a campaign, because not only is this going to help you spread the word of your campaign and raise awareness, but the organizations that you collaborate with, you're going to be able to share knowledge, share ideas, bounce ideas off each other. I mean, for example, I know Hannah because Wildlife and Countryside Link are partnering with us at the moment to work on a future campaign. And if it wasn't for that collaboration, I never would have met Hannah, and we probably wouldn't be sat having this conversation right now. So collaboration is a really great way to not just expand your campaign and expand its reach, but also make those lasting connections with other organizations who are doing similar things to you. And that's one thing I've learned about campaigning, especially in the nature space. Like, the nature crisis is so huge, it shouldn't be down to individuals to solve it. That's why we need to work together, all of us working on our own campaigns, but they all have they're all rooted in the same thing, and that's improving nature and improving the environment in the UK. So I hope that was an okay whistle-stop tour to campaigning and starting campaigning. If you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. But if everyone is happy, I will start going through the questions and we can begin the Q&A section. So bear with me one moment. So our first question, and this is aimed at you, Hannah, if that's okay. And this goes back to meeting the target, the 2030 target. What happens if the government doesn't meet that target?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Is that the question from Ellen?
Yes.
Yeah, so I guess it depends. If it's a binding target, then the government can be held to account by the Office of Environmental Protection. So they are there as a kind of statutory body to hold the government to account. So they can make recommendations to government, but they can also take the government to court. As can we as civil society. So we've seen lots of instances where either a member of the public or organizations have taken the government to court on not meeting their environmental commitments. So there might be kind of legal repercussions for the government. But also, I guess, on the kind of softer side, when a government doesn't meet its environmental commitments, it kind of, it fails to meet a promise that they've made to the public. So you can use that politically in campaigning to say, well, you haven't met this target, or you're not meeting this target, and you're breaking your promises to the public. And that obviously doesn't reflect well on them. So there are different ways to hold the government to account on their commitments, and they're both really important. Obviously, one is like a harder take them to court, or kind of bring about political pressure. And you can also do that kind of within government as well. So you can lobby, say, Labour MPs to put pressure on the government of the day, the Conservative government, to meet their commitments. So yeah, it's a bit of a vague answer, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. And our next question from David is, how much influence is there from the international scene? With EU legislation being abandoned, how much looser or stronger is environmental policy becoming?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think in terms of the influence that EU policy has on the UK, it is important, because the UK wants to be seen, and again, this is very kind of like a political thing, right? So the UK government wants to be seen to be doing better than our EU counterparts because of Brexit. They want to prove that Brexit was a great idea, and our environment will be better off for it. However, obviously we have a new government at the moment who are potentially scrapping a lot of these EU environmental regulations, and I think if that happens, we will very much be weaker for it. And we're already starting to see some areas where the UK is diverging from EU policy, and it's not as robust and it's not as strong. So I think it's important to be making that case, and also using lots of other examples as well of not just the EU, but looking elsewhere to other places where there are better environmental policies and saying, look, this can work. For example, we're talking about Silent Spring. You have a pesticide reduction target ask. That is elsewhere. There's a pesticide reduction target in Denmark, and we can look at those policies in Denmark and say, okay, Denmark is in the EU, but it's not an EU policy. But it will be, actually, it will be. And yeah, so you can look at examples of where there's really good policies and bring them back here and say, look, this can be done. But yeah, I think we're very much at risk of losing a lot of important environmental protections, and that's why campaigning is so vital at this time. I can't stress that enough. It's just, now campaigners are probably the most the most vital tool that nature has, I think.
Yeah, and I think the developments in the past week have definitely shown us that the current government is not putting nature and the environment first. So it's definitely going to be an interesting few months, coming up in terms of nature policy and what decisions the government decides to make. And campaigning can definitely sway government. A great example is Stop Cambo. So to stop the Cambo oil field off the north coast of Scotland. If it wasn't for that campaign, that oil field would have gone ahead. So as you said, campaigning, it does work. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it, but it does work, and it can make policy change. So the next few questions are related to policy careers, if that's all right, Hannah. So Jason says, don't forget the environmental professional bodies for policy jobs.
Yes. Thank you, Jason. Absolutely true.
And one thing, so just for context, I graduated this summer, so I'm job hunting at the moment, and environmental job boards are really, really good places to go for jobs. So a little plug for Wildlife and Countryside Link here. They have a vacancies page, which I found very useful. But you've got a job board called Environment Jobs. That's really good for looking for nature policy jobs as well. Can highly recommend looking on there, and LinkedIn as well. I found personally LinkedIn very useful for searching for policy jobs and policy opportunities. So if you have a LinkedIn, definitely utilize it. We have a question from Olivia, which is for you, Hannah. Could you go into more detail about your internship and how you got it?
Yeah, so I was really lucky. So the internship that I did was actually not in the UK, it was in Brussels. So this is before we left the EU. Basically, there was a Green member of the European Parliament who was doing paid internships, and she put it up like any other job ad, right? So she put it up online, and I applied and went through an interview process, and then I was really lucky to get it. So it's a 6-month paid internship where I got kind of policy experience of environmental policy making, basically, and also kind of political campaigning for the Greens. So the kinds of stuff that I was doing was on things like trade policy and how that impacts the environment. I was also doing stuff on agricultural policy. But also a big part of my job was writing back to members of the public who got in touch. So that was really lovely, because actually, as someone who'd written to my MEP before and someone who writes to my MP now, I got to see what it's like on the other side of the desk. So I got to see, you know, the kinds of issues that people care about, and I had to kind of like, you know, write considered responses back to them and actually kind of feel this responsibility for our constituents, because that's, you know, we're there to serve the public. Whenever we work for a politician or whenever we work for the government, we're there to serve the public. So yeah, it was a really great experience, and I actually ended up staying there for 2.5 years in the end, because I continued working for her almost right up until Brexit happened, really. So it was a brilliant opportunity. And I would say that with internships, often you do, I think someone mentioned this in the chat as well, like if you do an internship for a place, it's not always guaranteed that you'll get a job at the end, but, you know, often it does happen. So
yeah, that's exactly right. Mary said that she seconded your policy job. She started as a political research intern and now works for the Nature Friendly Farming Network. So definitely internships are a good step in the door, as it were, into getting your first job. So we have a question from Lizzie. So Lizzie says, what does your role involve for you? What would you typically do day to day, and what dictates what you work on at any given time? There's a few questions in here, so I'll leave it at that, and then we can do the rest of them in a minute.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. So day to day, I mean, I do a lot of researching, and I do a lot of writing, and I do a lot of coordination work, so between our members. So on the research side, I guess, if we're, you know, I'll do lots of things like writing briefings, either for DEFRA or for MPs. So if we want to inform MPs, or if we want to inform DEFRA about an issue and say, look, this is the change we want to see, and this is why we want to see it, then I'll kind of write a briefing to that effect. So that involves obviously desk-based research. So I'll kind of research like what the evidence is for supporting the policy change that we're asking for, and so on. So that's quite a big part of my job. And I also write kind of reports as well off the back of that. But another part of my role is sort of on coordination. So what I do is I tend to bring people from lots of our member organisations together to discuss policy positions. So I'll, if, you know, for instance, with recent rumours around agricultural policy, and maybe with environmental land management being weakened or scrapped, then what I'll do is I'll get in contact with our members who are interested in farming, and I'll say, let's get together to discuss this, and then we'll have a discussion, and we'll come up with a kind of a bit of an action plan on what we're going to do together to influence the government. But it, you know, it can really vary, because as Lottie says, we're working together at the moment on a campaign. So that work is obviously quite different. So sometimes it will be doing funding bids, or sometimes it will be writing communications materials. And sometimes, yeah, it will be kind of like planning, you know, really exciting kind of projects on, you know, data analysis, which actually doesn't sound very exciting, but I promise you it is. And like, you know, interactive tools for campaigning and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's very, very varied. But day to day, yeah, there's a lot of writing, a lot of researching, a lot of emailing, and a lot of calls, either with the government or with our members, or with our partners like UK Youth Furniture. So yeah, it's very varied, but in a really good way. I love it.
No, that's cool, thank you. And I'm just conscious of time, so any questions that we don't get to now, me and Hannah can discuss, and we can email our answers. So everyone's questions will be answered. I just can't guarantee they're going to be answered now, as we only have a few minutes left. But Francesca says, would you recommend any short courses to understand better policy making?
Oh, it's a really good question. Can I get back to you on that, because there's like a body that does like charity training basically, and they do lots of different kinds of training, and I think they might have some policy training. So I'll get back in touch. But I know that there are lots of like universities who do like short courses on policy, and actually there are loads of like free online things as well. So there's stuff like, well, webinars like this are always great, but if you're looking for kind of training, there are things like edX, which are free platforms that you can use to do courses. I don't know whether there's anything up on policy making at the moment or policy work, but I know that there has been previously. So just search for online courses. Universities often do short courses, but often they cost money. But then I do know that there are a couple of charitable bodies who run short courses as well, and I will look into that and send links to Lottie to send around.
Yeah, that's fine. And I can also recommend, they change the courses quite often, so you do have to keep looking, but the UN Environment Programme have a lot of online courses, and I've seen policy courses related to nature on there, so it's worthwhile having a look. But as I said, they change their courses quite regularly, so you might need to keep looking on that. And then unfortunately we'll probably have to leave it there, just because we have a minute left. I don't think a minute is enough time to answer the next few questions. So any of the questions that we've not answered, as I said, I'll go through those with Hannah, and we will get those answers out to you, so your questions will be answered. But I just wanted to say thank you so much to Hannah for being our speaker for tonight, and thank you so much to everyone who's joined this call. We really hope that you have enjoyed the session, that you've learned something. If you have any more questions, please feel free to message us on any of our socials, from our website, UK Youth for Nature, or via email. We will send out all our contact details and provide you with some more information on Wildlife and Countryside Link as well. But yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. I hope you enjoyed chatting about policy. I know I've definitely learned something tonight, and I hope everyone else has. So yeah, thank you very much everyone for attending. We do have another session coming up very soon on nature writing, so if you're interested in that, please do come along, and hopefully we'll see you at some more sessions. So thank you everyone.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Lottie.
Thank you Hannah. Thank you. Bye.